Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to touch on entrances, circulation, and some ADA guidelines that apply to both areas. So first, entrances. Entrances are really transitional spaces that can provide both an aesthetic experience as well as a functional one. So as we think about both residential and commercial buildings, we need to think about what the user is experiencing when first approaching the building. Of course, exiting as well. So these can be both, external, outside of the building, and interior experiences. So this example, we really start to have a nicely designed experience that the user feels all the way, up the stairs and into the building. So it's really kind of extending the interior to the exterior a little bit. Same kind of example here, this, glass enclosure that's introducing us to the space and kind of creating that build-up moment, while also, protecting individuals from the environment, right? And giving a transition space for, the temperature variations and moisture and all that to, kind of dissipate. Here again, we have the original kind of building, behind in this image, and in the foreground you have this really fun experience that's been created to kind of get you in the mood to go into that building, really. And when we get inside, then we also have this transitional space that really gives us a sense of place. And the entrance, the foyer space, should really convey what the overall design aesthetic is, what the space means, and how this all relates to the overall design of the home, right? So if we come into this large, grand, opulent space, we really expect the rest of the structure to have that same, attention to detail and experience. And this is really kind of offering us that wow moment when we come into the building. Here's a very different example, very rustic and, kind of almost crude in its way, right? And so we expect that, as we enter this building, the rest of the structure will, be in keeping with that, and we'll have this, dark wood and rustic cuts and all that throughout the space. In this example, a residential example, giving us this sort of open space at the bottom of the stairs, giving us the opportunity to ascend to the second floor, see through deeper into the home, and then also this foyer is being used as kind of an art display, kind of an art gallery type of space. So they can be, multifunctional and really give us a key to who lives there. So now we'll be moving on to the whole idea of circulation, corridors, hallways, if you will. So corridors are, of course, necessary. There are necessary routes and links from one defined space to another. So we can really have major and minor corridors that link areas. We also use these to control traffic flow and provide routes to, a variety of spaces and exits, of course, as well. So we can think of corridors as, really, controlling traffic and moving people. For example, when we think of an airport or something like that, where you have to get many, many people from one place to another, generally as quickly and efficiently as possible. So this is, kind of a major kind of high-speed corridor, really. We can also think of these spaces in residential dwellings and what that might mean. And they can be very, simple, straightforward, very clear path from, the front door into the space. We can think of these in, hotel rooms, office buildings, and what that experience is, and, what does that space look like, and how are we, communicating how you get from point A to point B. These corridors, these hallways can be quite grand in scale, very opulent and beautiful and artistic, and also really be an extension of that entrance and that foyer area, and be a beautiful space in and of itself to be experienced. And when we consider the relationship of paths to spaces, we really want to think about some corridors, some hallways, we go by spaces. Some we pass through spaces, and others we terminate in a space. So the routes of corridors, of hallways, can vary in width, contour, direction, but we really want to be thinking about offering something of interest along the way, right? So, this corridor, we're passing by a series of doors, getting point A from point B, but it's very interesting in the way the materials have been handled and the lines, and it's very, very dynamic. Another great example of a corridor, if there's any Star Trek fans out there, right? But, making our way through the spaceship, a lot of that show was actually, filmed, the idea being, in these corridors. So they're very, very important, the connection from point A to point B, what you pass by, and where the corridor might actually end. We can think of this in large spaces, academic situations, things like that, and that hallways can actually be rooms in a sense in and of themselves. And within these spaces, we can have, functional things like seating, lockers, storage, things like that. And again, these can be very beautiful, opulent spaces in which, of course, we, pass by some spaces that we may choose to enter. We can actually go through and cross other corridors and, terminate at the end of the hall into a space. And we can think about these as being kind of small scale spaces like the image on the left, and what beautiful moments we might create with, simple light and shadow and windows and things like that, and, what we can see ahead of us. And we can also think of these in larger public spaces, and, by simply, opening up, adding glass, allowing view from the hall into a room, you can create a more special experience in that hallway, being able to see in spaces, but then also opening those rooms up to the corridor itself. And thinking in terms of, the residential experience, we can connect the materials and themes from, living areas into the corridors and connect public to private spaces, maintaining that same look and theme. And we think of all of our design fundamentals topics, repetition and things like that, and how we can use, simple elements like that to create really beautiful, dynamic spaces that play with the architectural shapes and then the dynamics of light and shadow. We can also have corridors that maybe don't look so starkly defined, maybe not as clearly defined as, the hallways on the Enterprise, right, where we're clearly going down a defined space. But we can have corridors that are implied by either some simple floating architectural elements or the furniture arrangements. This example, by having the furnishings, the sofa, the dining table, and everything along the central axis, implied corridors are created on either side that allow traffic to flow not only forward to back in this image, but to the exterior as well. So we think about corridors, we think about them not only as we experience them in a three-dimensional space, but also how they lay out on a floor plan. And so looking at an example like this, we can see very clearly defined paths, very understandable, regular layouts of furniture, and this is a very easy to navigate type of space. Unlike an example like this, which happens to be the University Hospital at UW-Madison, which is notoriously known for being a terribly difficult building to navigate, laid out on this angular grid structure. It was meant to create this, kind of interesting connection, coded by colors and letters. But the experience of it actually is very difficult and not pleasant at all. There's no obvious connection from point A to point B. And getting around this kind of jigsaw puzzle of a building can be very, very difficult. And this problem is only exacerbated by the fact that usually when you're there, you're either not feeling well, or you're visiting someone who's not feeling well. So it can be a very stressful experience that's actually quite amplified by the unclear corridors throughout the space. So thinking about entrances and thinking about corridors, we need to start thinking about ADA, building codes. So what is ADA? ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came to be on July 26, 1990. So the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, has 5 titles to it. Title 1, dealing with employment, so equal employment opportunity for individuals with disabilities. Title 2, state and local government, so non-discrimination on the basis of disability in state and local government services. Title 3, public accommodations, non-discrimination on the basis of disability by public accommodations and in commercial facilities. Title 4, telecommunications, and Title 5, miscellaneous provisions. So Title 3 is what interior designers are generally the most concerned about with dealing with ADA codes. So again, Title 3 is dealing with public accommodations. So this title prohibits private places of public accommodation from discriminating against individuals with disabilities. So what does that mean? Well, public accommodations includes privately owned, leased, or operated facilities such as places like hotels, restaurants, retail spaces, doctor's offices, private schools, daycares, gyms, sport facilities, movie theaters, golf courses, all of those types of public spaces. So what the title does is set the minimum standards for accessibility for alterations and new construction of facilities. So it requires public accommodations to remove barriers in existing buildings where it's relatively easy to do so without much difficulty or expense. And it directs businesses to make reasonable modifications to their usual way of doing things when serving people with disabilities. So it requires that they take steps necessary to communicate effectively with customers with vision, hearing, and speech disabilities. This title is regulated and enforced by the Department of Justice. So to just start out with, what does all of that mean to me as an interior designer? What we can start out with are some very basic codes and things to start paying attention to. And first is clearances needed for wheelchairs, though that's a really big area of concern. So as we're laying out floor plans and thinking about spaces that the public will use, again, possible for like hotels, retail, anything like that, we can start thinking about the basic clear space required for a wheelchair and a wheelchair to turn around. So on the left, we see the basic wheelchair dimensions in a plan view. So this means for a wheelchair to be able to exist in a space, we need a clear space on the floor that's 30 inches by 48 inches. So 30 by 48 rectangle. And then we also need to think about the turning radius. So someone in the wheelchair being able to pivot and turn around in a circle. That's called the turning radius, and that minimum clearance is 5 feet wide. So a 5-foot diameter circle is the minimum turning radius. We need to think about, the clear space required in, things like alcoves and how someone in a wheelchair might turn around. And so thinking about that 30-inch by 48-inch rectangle that's required, first of all, with that alcove, the maximum depth that something like that could have would be 24 inches. And thinking about maneuvering clearance, we want an extra 6 inches on the side if that alcove is deeper than 24 inches. As we make our way down corridors, right, we have all sorts of things that we need to consider. So to meet ADA minimums in a public space, a minimum corridor width is 36 inches. If we're thinking about an egress corridor, that means one for exiting the building, required to get out of the building. If you're thinking about if there's fires or something like that, that is a corridor width of 44 inches at a minimum. They can, of course, be wider, but that's the minimum. So a standard corridor, within a space, 36 is the minimum. And an egress, one that we need to get out of the building, needs to be 44 inches. Then looking at this chart, you'll see all kinds of different conditions and situations that might occur and the minimum clearances that would be required in those spaces. So for example, looking over here on the left, we see for a corridor that someone in a wheelchair and someone walking next to them would be going down. We're looking at a clearance of 4 feet 6 inches. Here we have a condition where the individual is going up a ramp. Okay, and that's the line here is indicating a ramp on each end. And we have a 1 to 12 max slope. Okay, so we have a 36-inch minimum width, and the handrail extends out 12 inches. Okay, and 12 inches here as well. If we have a situation where we're coming up the ramp and turning, we need a 5-foot minimum landing. And then down here as we make our way, we have 42-inch and 42-inch here as well. Making our way up and around, you can follow all of these measurements. So if you have a 36-inch wide corridor, for example, here on each side, then we'll need at least 48 inches here to make that turn, for example. Then down here at the end, you'll see that the absolute minimum width for an opening, so thinking a passageway or a doorway, is 32 inches. Okay, 32 inches. And the depth of that could be no more than 24 inches. Following that same basic path, we see some more really important measurements, including 2 wheelchairs side by side in a corridor. We're looking at a 5-foot width, right? We have the 36 hallway again with that required 48 inches in length we see here. And that's really, again, so that the wheelchair can turn, get straightened out, and turn again without having to do any kind of difficult maneuvering, right? If someone's going to do a 180-degree turn, we have a condition where we have at least 5 feet by 36. Here again we see the 44-inch minimum corridor width for an egress corridor. Again, that's when we need to exit the building. And then to get into this elevator, we're seeing the minimum measurements of 5'8" to 4'3" with a 36-inch minimum door. This slide shows the variety of conditions that will happen at a doorway. So these are all the maneuvering clearances that we need. On the bottom of the screen here, the person in the wheelchair is approaching the door on the push side. So in each situation, the person will be approaching the side of the door in which they push it away from themselves. On the top of the screen, we see a condition where the individual is always on the pull side of the door, meaning they're going to be pulling the door out towards themselves in some fashion. And then in each case, we just think about the approach a little bit. So in this situation, the individual is coming up on the push side, on the hinge side of the door, so that the door handle is over here. They're pushing it away from themselves. So they need a 4'6" by 42-inch minimum clear space to be able to do this maneuver. Over here, we're seeing an individual approach on the push side, handle side, and they're pushing the door that way. So they need a 42-inch minimum width here, and then at least 24 inches by the handle. Over here, with a straight approach, a minimum of 12 inches by the handle. So in each condition, you can see the required measurements, depending on the situation that you'll have in your particular floor plan. Paying attention to push side, or again up here on the pull side. That's a very basic introduction to a few of the really important and required building codes, again from the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act.